As always, it's my pleasure to have back with me today Charles Hugh Smith, well-followed and prolific writer on the web, who is the publisher of the well-followed website of2minds.com. Time once again, Charles, to exchange some ideas, which I always look forward to. Any key new themes in your current writing that you want to share with our listeners before we start today?
Just the decay of globalization and financialization, and of course, we're gonna our discussion today connects to those themes.
Charles, as I normally do, I need to stress with our new viewers that this is not an interview. We do these videos as a way of us productively dialoguing the important trends we're identifying and simply make our discussions available to the public for those that might be interested or want to contribute some comments, which we truly welcome and value. What we want to discuss in this session is the impact of the plundering of productive financial assets through policies of easy money, which has inevitably led to failed investment and wasted capital. And I'm showing here the key messages that we want to highlight here. To market manipulation and gaming has robbed us of desperately needed massive amount of investment capital, which is going to become increasingly scarce. And that investment capital needed to have been spent, and even more so going forward. And that investment is required to do a number of things. One is facilitate a more highly productive labor force through training, education, a series of things that we're not thinking about because we don't understand the magnitude of the shift in the attitude of the new workforce, the generations, whether it's Gen X, Gen Ys, or Gen Zs. And that investment is needed for competitive advantage to accommodate these cultural shifts, because they have a whole different attitude on shifting work-life balance needs and resources and expectations. It is likely that the workforce, in my opinion, Charles, and I think you agree with it too, is about to profoundly change labor relations as it rebels, frankly, from disposable incomes getting crushed and standards of living squeezing even further. And companies are simply not prepared for the coming collapsing profits if real labor productivity is not improved in an era of a sustained stagflation, which lies ahead. And finally, further cost cutting, which has been the order of the day. It'll be failed waste, increasingly reject historical corporate norms, which no longer facilitate a more personally rewarding and balanced quality of life. Did I net it out there, Charles, in your estimation?
Yeah, I think you did, Gordon, and I just want to emphasize 2 points. One is you and I tend to be a couple years ahead of trends, and so to you and I, the trends that the lack of investment in labor productivity and in greater efficiencies in the fundamental sense, these are going to be the trends for the next decade, and there have been times in the past where malinvestment caught up with us and we had to go through some painful adjustments. And so it's all going to be good, but we have to change what we're investing in and what as you say, the incentives are. It has to move from speculation and basically financial churn to actually faster, better, cheaper.
I'm showing here the agenda we hope to cover with the assistance of about 30 supporting slides here. The plundering we have witnessed is hard to truly estimate, but it's well in excess, in my estimation, about $50 trillion over the last 40 years or so. And it has created massive growth in wealth inequality as it's used in various methods, with the gaming of debt for equity swaps being the most, in my opinion, most brazen. Let's start with your slide, Charles, which you've used many times in your writing shown here. Would you like to explain it and what actually prompted you to put it together?
Gordon, this slide is based on research from the Rand Corporation, which did a deep dive into the income from labor and the increases in capital over the last 45 years. And what they found was that basically capital had siphoned $50 trillion from workers. And this was not just from globalization, not just offshoring factories and so on to make use of cheap labor overseas. It was also policy decisions made here in the U.S.
And so many of them was just robbing money right from what should have been a reinvestment in our labor force. And I'm showing a slide here of two blatant examples, and there are a raft of them, obviously. But we shifted 15, 20 years ago from what was called defined benefits to contributory benefits. It got very little real play in the media. But suddenly what that did, well, it took away pensions, period. And it placed you as responsible for creating your own pensions and the vagrancy of investing in the stock market. Whereas with a defined benefit, the corporation took responsibility for that, and it was fixed. So you had the three legs of the stool when you retired. You had Social Security, you had your savings, and you had your corporate or company pension. Well, that stool's now gone, and it's put people in tremendous difficulties of really effectively retiring today. That was money that the corporation wasted it because they turned around and used it for other things we'll talk about in a moment that is suddenly just liquidated. Also, another blatant example, this relentless cost reductions. They just stopped investing in the labor itself, the training and education, and creating the kinds of work environment conducive to loyalty. So we started seeing rapid turnover. Meanwhile, corporations and institutions were demanding higher education levels for all of their workers. Let me call it being even increasingly institutionally certified of the labor pool, where these degrees and advanced degrees were financed by the labor pool itself. That is the cost of universities and tuition, which has just got the youth completely behind the eight ball before they even have their first day at work. Those are just blatant examples. There are many more. Any comments on those, Charles?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, and that you are a living example of how corporate America used to invest in their own staff and bring them along, and now the policy is just poach talent from somebody else.
You don't have a view of the way it was not that many years ago. You know, I graduated with an undergraduate and a postgraduate degree. I had no student debt. Then when I joined the corporation, even with that, they wouldn't allow me to talk to a customer for well over a year, where they sent me to school, internal school and training, even with those with advanced degrees, before I was allowed out. And I wasn't anything special. That's just the way it was. But today, you've got to hit the road where you expect it to be able to do a job day one. And that isn't actually reality, because every company's different. And there's a lot of training and tutoring that goes on from your peers more senior than you that help you through that kind of process. And there's time allocated. That's the big difference. It's created this, in many ways, this debt for equity swap gaming going on that shows itself up in the blatant use of stock buybacks. And since 2001, the S&P 500 alone has employed over $10 trillion, Charles. I was shocked when I really went through and did the tape total. And $12 trillion in the United States alone of corporate capital has been used to buy back shares with no other real purpose than other to drive the stock prices up. And the prices that have now started to come down here since the beginning of the year, where we've liquidated $29 trillion worth of wealth. Wealth has been extracted from the equity and bond markets together since the beginning of the year. What did we accomplish except this capital disappeared? Well, it got put into other pockets. And I put the bond market in that loss number because a substantial amount of the money used for buybacks was corporate shares, where the money was borrowed, and the primary way of doing that was issuing new corporate bonds. Effectively, they swapped future debt obligations for equity prices today, and those who sold the corporate equities today have had the opportunity to exit before the debt has to be paid. They've fled the party as market prices become unsustainable, since they knowingly know that the debt payments would eventually depress the earnings. But it gets worse than that, Charles, not to be negative, but this is, again, I'll use this word, brazen and blatant. They also use borrowed money to pay dividends, and these dividends paid more than the treasuries and bank rates, thereby making stocks an attractive yield and for basically starved investors and institutions. So this, coupled with stock buybacks, was frankly a giddy cocktail for the markets, and that's why we've had this explosion, or had, and I stress the word had, this explosion in markets. And unless this is sustained, we have a problem. But the bottom line is, we didn't use that money to invest in productive assets. It's gone. to wherever it went, to money haven, shall we say. Any comments on those charts, Charles?
Yeah, I think that's great, Gordon. And I just want to emphasize that that 10 trillion, as you said, did not create any, didn't improve productivity. It didn't create any jobs. It didn't create higher investments in automation. I mean, it did nothing for the real economy and nothing for productivity. Zero. All it was financialization churning, like you said, debt into equity that benefited the few at the expense of the many.
A major casualty of this pillaging is lost U.S. productivity. We've stopped investing in the labor force to the degree that was required, and even more so is going to be required. And we'll get into where that investment should be made specifically in a moment. But first, maybe for those who aren't seeing what's happening with U.S. productivity numbers, let's just look at those for a moment. Non-farm productivity declined at a 4.6% annualized rate in the second quarter, making the second consecutive decline. It's really coming home to roost now. The trend in productivity growth has worsened compared to the pandemic, and the surge in unit labor costs make the Fed's challenge of getting inflation back down to its 2% target just all the more challenging. The second quarter's contraction comes on the heels of the sharpest decline in 74 years, Charles, in Q1 at a negative 7.4%. Smoothing through the seesaw ride of quarterly productivity growth, the past year suggests it has worsened compared to before, as I said, the COVID-19 pandemic. And the weak productivity growth makes the Fed's inflation challenge that much harder. Even if workers are more productive, companies can't afford to pay them more without pressuring profits or fueling a wage price spiral, which is beginning to happen. And so this, what they call the unit labor cost, or ULC, that is productivity adjusted for the cost of labor, rose at a 10.8% annualized pace in Q2. And this marks the second consecutive quarter of double-digit gains and suggests businesses will be forced to continue to pay workers more to produce less. They're going to force them because we're producing less for a higher amount of money. That's the worst thing you can do for productivity. This chart really brings it home too, Charles. The Fed simply can't get to 2% inflation with this sort of productivity and wage growth. And labor costs tend to be a stickier contributor to inflation. Thus, the Q2 productivity data positions the Fed to continue on its tightening path until it sees wage price growth subside and inflation moving meaningfully lower. And the reason labor productivity has collapsed is that they come back to, as you said, core policy decisions: over-regulation, over-taxation, monetary expansion, credit market manipulation, and a near total intervention of economic and business life by what I call a grossly out of control tax and spend regulatory state. And remember, production determines consumption. And production has collapsed in many ways, in a big way across the major G7s. An extended period of economic decline, therefore, will follow. And the result of falling productivity will mean a fall in standard of living. And it's interesting that this is my projections of what we see in the fall of standard of living. And I've done a fair bit of work on putting this chart together. But this mirrors this chart, which is what we're seeing in a collapse in the market, or a steady bear market over a protracted period of time with some violent counter rallies, and in the destruction of personal wealth. And we've come at it from different ways, but it centers around harnessing the labor force productively. Comments, Charles, on any of that?
I want to mention when you say like kind of a tax and spend regulatory situation, that's been a huge drag on productivity because what we've done here in the U.S. and other developed countries is we've increased the inefficiencies in our system, basically putting sand in the gears by over-regulating, over-taxing, making things that should be streamlined so complicated that it adds tremendous cost to the system. And for instance, how many permits it takes to start a new business, and how long it takes to get a building permit. These are just examples of things that used to take days and now take months or even years. And so, of course, how can you have a productive economy when you just keep pouring sand in the gears? And so there's that. And then I also want to mention that economists have often talked about the productivity paradox, that we've invested heavily in computers and and technology, and yet our productivity hasn't necessarily reflected that. And of course, that's a complicated topic because it takes a while to develop the tools and so on. But I think we're also underinvesting in getting rid of these systemic inefficiencies. In other words, we're looking at producing more hamburgers per worker when we should be looking at how do we streamline the regulatory processes that the businesses are burdened with. And we also have to mention healthcare because, of course, it's a huge uh, drag on productivity and competitive status in the world for the U.S. to pay, $2 trillion plus in healthcare, much of which is wasted, profiteering, uh, shuffling paper, or even outright fraud. So we're not dealing with the issues that are dragging down productivity.
Precisely, Charles. These are all solvable, but they're not a priority under the various administrations. I'm not trying to pick on a party here. They used to say the business of America was business. Somehow that's been lost. We've squandered a tremendous opportunity. And what is even more concerning is we may not have another opportunity to fix this for some time, if at all. We may have lost the window potentially. I thought we'd kick off this point, Charles, with another chart you've developed.
This is a well-known, we could call it a trait of nature called the S curve, where businesses and nations get a boost from investment and their productivity rises, consumption rises, they get a virtuous cycle. But eventually, the sand gets added to the gears. and so things, the productivity and everything starts declining. And what's happened in kind of globally is credit has now become, the so-called solution. Instead of solving the real world inefficiencies and problems, we just borrow more and then pay for the inefficiencies and decline in productivity with borrowed money. And that, of course, is not a winning strategy. That's how you get collapse. And that's the basis of this chart, is that we're playing financial games, as you said, borrowing more and more money to pay for inefficiencies and a decline in productivity, where what we need to do is start investing in improving efficiencies and productivity instead of just borrowing more to paper over the sand in the gears.
Exactly. U.S. investors have enjoyed a magnificent, what I'll call beta, for a dozen years. A 60-40 equity bond portfolio generated 10.5% annual average returns between March 2009, just after the financial crisis, and January of this year. But there have been 4 what I'll call beta droughts since 1900. What they are is extended periods of little or no beta return. And 3 of those 4 historical beta droughts were in the 1910s, the 1940s, and the 1970s. And they were caused by rising inflation, what I often refer to as the 5% inflation regime, which they all have and we have right now. And they're typically a decade where the CPI itself, as I said, is over 5%. And those 3 inflation episodes were associated with World War I, World War II in the 40s, and the oil shock in the 70s. The U.S. may now be entering what can best be called another beta drought, and U.S. returns are now at risk from both the prospect of higher inflation and the headwinds to return from a high starting point valuations. This is what the lack of investment leads to, or proper investment, or where you create inflation or sustained elevated financial valuations. And the markets have already priced in falling earnings expectations, as this chart shows, through substantial forward PE ratio reductions. But earnings per share overall as of Q2 have held up, but that's soon going to change. And according to a just released Fed paper titled The Coming Long Run Slowdown in Corporate Profit Growth and the Stock Returns, this is from the Fed. This is what they're warning the banks about, and I quote, "The reduction in interest and tax expense is responsible for a full one-third of all profit growth over the last 2-decade period. That boost to corporate profits is indicating notably lower stock returns in the future," end of quote. And when profits and growth fall, normally cash flows fall off. And what this means is a high probability fall off in that $10 trillion rate of stock buybacks. It means reduced cash and borrowing capabilities for inflating those dividend payouts. Instead of reducing interest expense, we're now seeing rising interest expense. And instead of reduced tax expenses, we're now seeing a rising tax expense with the U.S. government's new 15% minimum corporate tax being implemented as part of the just signed Inflation Reduction Act. So we can expect, I mean, it's just almost locked in that the beta drought is going to be a very real eventuality. We may have, in fact, squandered our future here to really effectively invest in productivity. And another major issue is about being able to finance that investment in productivity is the availability of credit for lending, because capitalism is based on capital, not credit. Before I just get into that, Charles, any comments I've made so far you want to touch on?
Yeah, I want to go back to your beta drought periods, which tend to be about a decade.
Yes.
And I want to focus on, I've been writing about the 70s, which is, a lot of people are referring to the 70s because there was also stagflation. But what people forget, and what I've been trying to emphasize, is that that was actually a huge transition in the U.S. economy, where in today's money, trillions of dollars was invested in new plant that was much more efficient, used less energy, and produced less pollution. Right? That was the start of the Clean Air and Water Act. The EPA. And, there were rivers catching on fire, and the smog was horrible. And that all had a cost in our human health and also in our global competitiveness, because we had plants that were out of date. So a lot of investment was put into the 70s, and it did not create profits because it was invested in cleaning up the environment and in improving the productivity of our industrial plant. That was the gains from that were then collected in the 80s and 90s. And so if we make the investments in the next few years, we can gain the benefits for the next several decades. If we don't make the investment, then we're just going to be in a stagflationary sort of death spiral.
Unfortunately, we now have a system, Charles, as I was saying there earlier, is that it's based on credit now, not savings for the purchase of productive assets. And you can see from this chart here, the rising green area, that the Federal Reserve is increasingly required to increase its balance sheet to finance the shortfall needs for credit, shown in black. And you can also see that the rest of the world, or ROW here, is slowly reducing its buying of U.S. treasuries. That is, China's not buying or is reducing. Russia's sold them all. I think Japan is selling right now to hold up at the yen. So we have a problem in the rate of growth of credit. We no longer appear to be able to increase the real credit growth at a rate of 2% per year, which is the threshold required to keep the U.S. out of a recession. And actually, with the inflation running at current or even marginally lower levels, the U.S. faces the strong possibility of a severe recession or worse. More pressures on a shortage of investment capital are looming here. To reiterate what we mentioned before, we have the strategic need for investment, which is an imperative to maintaining global competitiveness. And we need this capital investment for an immediate short-term gains in labor productivity. And the new cultural headwinds from fallout of that $50 trillion capital exploitation are lost loyalty, jobs insecurity, balance of benefits. And so what we're now seeing is quiet quitting surge and a surge in early resignations, people quitting. And this is the Gen Ys and the Gen Zs rebelling. And Charles, the other day I was reading, I think, well, it's the developed countries, maybe the U.S. No, it's across the world. But I was reading in China, they now have something called the Dink generation. And Dink is D-I-N-K, and what that stands for is double income, no kids. The way they're rebelling is they're saying, we'll have two incomes, no kids, and therefore we'll be able to have the quality of life we want. They're not reducing their working effort. The sign of across the world is rebellion. What's happened is people have watched the stress of the Gen X parents and vowed a different outcome for them. And then you have the peer pressure of social media and what other friends are doing if you're not doing it, and whether you become a slave to the system. And this is profound. because we're talking, 73 million Gen Zs, that is the Zoomer generation, now really coming into the workforce in a big way. The Gen Ys, which is the millennial generations, and they've both grown up under the auspices of social media, whose parents are Gen X's, who really just were through all the PCs and starting to get on, and so there's this tremendous shift. And we don't understand it properly. And what's happened is COVID, is stay at home, has manifested this rebellion, because if they're saying, I don't want to go back and live that way anymore. I've had a taste of freedom. Maybe I'm exaggerating that. And they're really saying, I don't want that in my life. I don't want to do that. And we've talked about these issues previously, but on a longer term basis, we have massive investment required in all areas of what I'll call sustainability. And I don't just mean energy sustainability. And they're all parts of, Charles, what you've documented, what you refer to as the landfill economy, this complete wastage, and what we could be doing differently. Any comments on any of that, Charles?
Yeah, thank you, Gordon. I just want to mention that a lot of the so-called profit gains of the last couple decades is some people call it basically self-exploitation. In other words, it wasn't because the workforce became more productive due to a higher training. It was that people were expected to work extra hours without any pay or compensation. And as you pointed out, they were supposed to go borrow $50,000 and get another advanced degree. And so the labor force is rebelling globally because it was actually being pressured to exploit themselves as opposed to becoming more productive. In other words, you're just supposed to work harder and longer without any further compensation. And so that's why the global workforce is rebelling. That's not a sustainable system. And then I also want to mention your strategic imperative, which I think is a tremendously important phrase. It is an imperative. It's either adapt or die. That's the law of nature, and that's the law of economics as well. And so we forget that a couple generations ago, when you had an American-made product, it was expected to last for a generation or maybe two generations. And now the durability of all products, most products, has been in steep decline. And of course, there's many reasons for this. One is planned obsolescence, is that now to get you to buy another one in 2 or 3 years, it's been designed to fail in a few years. But it's also a terrible decline in quality as a result of shipping all the production overseas, where quality control simply isn't there. And so how can you have productivity if you're throwing away so much stuff?
Exactly, Charles. Brazen example, to use that word again. Yesterday, we had a new refrigerator. My wife decided we've had this one fridge for over 30 years, no problems. But she said, Gord, it's getting pretty old. We should buy a new fridge. And I said, well, if that's what you want, new style and whatever. So she bought it. It was, I would say, 5 to 6 times what I paid for that fridge 30 years ago that we're replacing. And that's fine. It came in. But the people delivering the fridge and placing it in felt obligated because they're doing this every day. So they're picking up fridges that are being replaced like we were. But he said to us, and he said, this fridge is only going to last you 10 to 15 years. Not the 30 years you've had in the last fridge. And I says, why is that? He says, I don't know why that is. I'm just telling you, I'm picking up fridges that are 10 years old all the time. And the people are just absolutely angry about it. And if there's nothing in your warranty, because you have to pay for the extended warranty, which may give you 3 years, that's just the way it is. And he felt so bad as just a simple delivery contractor to tell us that this is what you need to expect. I'll be back in 10 to 15 years to put a new fridge in here. That is how, and it's again 5 to 6 times what we paid for the first one. And I don't mean to get personal here, Charlie, but what you're saying is real world. It's happening. And where's the productivity in that? What that is productivity because they're claiming the profits. What's happening is we're short-circuiting our society, and that's disposable income that's going up in smoke. that has to be then put back in so the workers can survive. The game just catches you and eats you alive. Any comments on that before I recap here, Charles?
No, I'm glad you mentioned that story from real life, because of course I could add dozens, literally dozens and especially of brands that used to provide quality that even now, even the best brands are now filled with defects.
Well, and I'm sure all our listeners are frustrated and give you an example, but this is a reflection of what the shortchanging that we're doing, and there's a penalty. It comes back to haunt. And, even if you buy that refrigerator, think how much more your salaries have to be to make it up. What we're really facing and why this is so important with productivity is this cultural shift that's coming, and are we ready for it? And can we finance and adapt to it? Because if we don't, productivity is going to fall at a faster and faster rate as we have this rebellion starting to hit. And it's a hard reality, and it's there. And right now, the powers to be in the policy people are not even looking at it. They don't even think it's an issue, but it is. And so we must focus and prioritize on elements that will really boost competitive productivity in the long term, because Russia and China, who are organizing the commodity players around the world into alliances, are not sitting back aimlessly. They're not going to allow us to gain competitive advantage. They're playing a long game, and I'm not sure we have strategies in place to play it. And these are the kinds of things I'm showing here. And it gets into our whole approach to energy right now. It's one thing, and I believe we need to go green, maybe not for the reasons we're being told, but it is the right thing to do. It's a massive investment that will give us a competitive advantage. But if the other people around the world aren't doing it, and they're not, China, Russia, India, they're not doing it to any extent, they gain a really competitive advantage. But we can turn that against them if we did it right, with right implementation plan and the financing to do it. But we're not doing it correctly right now. So we've potentially mortgaged our future. We can get out from under it, but it's going to require some really careful and strong leadership to do it. Any concluding comments, Charles?
Yeah, I just want to mention, in your cultural shift on the workforce, I want to make two quick points. One is that part of the frustration the younger generations have is that assets, because of this financialization and churn that we've talked about, that housing is now unaffordable. It's very expensive to have kids, childcare, healthcare is, unaffordable. So it's the excesses that we've enabled in credit and inefficiencies. That's a core reason why the young generations are frustrated, is that things are too expensive because they're terribly inefficient, and yet we just pay for the inefficiencies instead of focusing on making all those sectors more productive. And the other point I want to mention is, a lot of people have a lot of hope about artificial intelligence and automation, and certainly there's a lot of investment in those tools for productivity, but you still need highly trained people, because it's individuals who create the ideas and implement the technology that becomes automation, but you can't automate everything. So the investment is across a broad spectrum. As you say, energy, automation, technology, and people.
Charles, we have to wrap. We're out of time. Any other closing comments you have, or until we meet again?
Yeah, please visit me at of2minds.com, and free samples of my books and archives are free.
Thank you very much, Charles. We'll talk again.
Okay, thank you, Gordon.
Bye.